Well, good afternoon. I wanted to go through some details on the directions for paper number 4. So if you want to take a minute and get your notebook out and get a pen or a pencil, I'm going to go through some details that I've talked about because I've talked about the book. I've talked a little bit about Porcelino and his background and some ways to approach the book. But what I'm going to do in this video is talk a little bit more specifically about the directions themselves as a kind of recap of them. At this point, again, they're repetitive. They're very similar to what we did in papers 2 and 3. But I want to kind of go through some of the details of it and just offer some suggestions as you're working on this paper. And I also briefly want to mention how this paper is going to connect in with paper number 5 that we're going to be doing next, which is the last paper for the class. Not the last assignment, because we do have the revision that we'll do in early May, and we will have at least one more quiz. But as far as the bigger papers, we have one after this, and 4 and 5, much like papers 2 and 3, connect together. And I'll just mention that briefly. It's too early to really talk that much in detail about that right now. Until you're done with paper number 4. But let me just go through some basic details. I'm going to do a screen share here. That's why the the image is a little fuzzy. It's because I'm recording this through Zoom on my computer, so I can do the screen share. But I'm going to just briefly go through the directions, point out some highlights to have you think about as you're finishing these papers and working on them. And then I'm also going to just mention a couple of things in the resources in the folder that's on Blackboard. So let me do the screen share, and let's see what we got here. So first off, let me just go to the directions and just mention some basic things for this paper that I want you all to think about. As always, if you have any questions, you're welcome to send me an email and let me know, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. But as far as the overall structure of this paper, this one's 3 to 4 pages long, right? So you want to make sure that you're at least to the bottom of page 3 and maybe even onto page 4. If it goes longer than 4 pages, a couple of you have asked, is that a problem? That's not a problem. I don't take off if it's longer than 4 pages. Although if it starts getting into like 6 or 7 pages, that's where you might have to kind of pull it back a little bit. But I've only had that happen occasionally with this assignment on this particular part of the semester over the years. So a lot of this in the first part is pretty standard stuff, right? So you've got, all the formatting for the fonts and everything else. One thing to be aware of, though, with this one is that you do need at least 6 direct quotations. Now, that's always a minimum. I mention that because, with a lot of papers, as I've probably said before, students will say, well, how many quotations should I use? And that's a difficult question to answer, because when the more of these kind of papers you do, where you're incorporating research materials from outside sources, you're going to find that you're not going to worry so much about how many quotations you're using. You may know how many sources that a professor wants you to use, but as far as how many quotations, that is really dependent upon the topic you're working on, how much material, what kind of material it is that you're writing about. As a general rule, it's always best to have more of your ideas and your opinion and your thinking as opposed to having too much of the outside quoted material. You don't want that to dominate what you're saying, but at the same time, you don't want to underutilize the quoted material, because in that case, you don't want to just be plugging in quotations just for the sake of plugging them in. The goal is to have looked at this material, have absorbed it, thought about it, and then respond to it. It's your foundation for a paper like this is that research. So for this one, the way I think of it and the way I break it down in my imagination when I'm thinking about an essay like this is that you want at least 2 direct quotations or so from Perfect Example itself, from the book. In fact, let me get my copy of the book. It's here somewhere on my desk. I was doing some other work today, and I all my books are out of order here. But let me get my copy of it of the newer edition of the book. And so for Perfect Example, you want to probably have at least 2 quotations from it, or at least references to scenes or panels that you might be discussing in the second half of your paper. And then for the other ones, you want to have at least 2 each from the outside sources you're using on Porcelino. So at least 2 quotations, short quotations, from whichever of the 2 outside sources you're using. So if you want to think of it that way, that's easier for me to think about it when I'm writing essays like this. 2 from each of the sources you're using, the outside sources, which in this case are interviews with Porcelino for the most part. There's a couple of essays in there that you're welcome to use. And then 2 references to the book itself. That's a good way to kind of break it down and to sort of organize your paper. Now, again, for this one, what's different about this paper, in fact, this is even different than paper number 5, where I have a very specific question I'm going to ask you, which again, I'll talk about at the end of this video. You're coming up with your own thesis based on your reading of the book and your reading of the sources. And so again, I've made suggestions in the other videos. You might write about his love of music. You might write about how he writes about depression and anxiety. You might be writing about your own response to the book and what you thought of it as you were reading. So that's another way to think about your approach to it, is you have the freedom in this paper to come up with your own topic. And a lot of you have come up with some great ideas. That's why I asked you that quiz question last week. And if I saw any issues with it, I mentioned that. If you had specific questions about your topic, then I also gave you some suggestions or things to look at. So again, with this one, I've still given you the sources that you're using. I've kind of given you that framework to work within. But within that framework, now you have a lot more freedom in this essay to sort of develop that thesis. What is it that you want to say? What is your opinion on Porcelino now that you've read his work? And so in relation to that with the outline, the structure of this paper is identical to papers 2 and 3, and paper number 5 will have the same structure. And if you remember nothing else from this class, when you get into other courses where they're asking you to use outside sources and to incorporate them and to quote them and to cite them and to use a works cited page or a reference page if you're in a social science class, this format will serve you well. You have your introduction with your thesis, first part of the paper, paragraphs 2 and 3, first half or so of the paper, are those quotations from your research, from your outside sources. What did you learn about Porcelino? What did you learn about his Buddhism? What did you learn about his love of music? What did you learn about his books? If you looked at my articles, some of you I know we're going to use those as sources for this. What did I say as someone who's written about this book before in the 2 articles that I've published on this book over the last 10 years? So you have quite a range of sources, which I'll also talk about in a minute when I go into that folder. And then in the second half of the paper, as we did in paper 2, as we did in paper 3, you're going to then analyze, talk about at least one scene from the book that you thought was interesting. You don't need to summarize the whole plot of the book. You don't need to put in other people's opinions of perfect example in the second half. I want to know what you thought about it. And I want to know not only what you thought about the writing, but even the artwork. What did you think of his drawing style? And again, if you didn't like it, that's fine. You can say that. If you found it really interesting and it's kind of minimalist quality, you could write about that too in the second half. But that's your second half of the paper. So remember, introduction with a thesis, the research part of the paper, which is paragraphs 2 and 3, where you're acknowledging, quoting from, and summarizing and discussing the sources that you used. The analysis in the second half of the paper, where you're taking what you learned and discussing from your point of view and your opinion what you thought of a particular scene from the book. And then a conclusion where you sum everything up. So same format. We did that with the Binder paper back in February. And we also did that with the Binder and Ellison paper in March. So again, papers 2, 3, and 4 have the same structure, and paper 5 that we'll be doing next to finish out the class also has that same structure. Again, intro, use of the outside sources, analysis from your perspective of whatever book it is, the primary source, in this case, it's Perfect Example that we're looking at, and then your conclusion. Now, for MLA format, by this time of the class, we should have that down pretty well. We've used MLA for every paper this semester, I guess, except for the midterm. We didn't use it for that because that was more of a personal narrative thing, sort of assignment. So here, remember, on all my directions, I always put the reminder of how to use outside sources. As a quick reminder of that, if it's an online electronic source with an author, then all you need in the parentheses after the quotation is the last name of the author. In the case of these interviews, Porcelino is not the author of the interview. It still would be Rob Clow, for example. It's Jason Heller. It's Megan Kirby. It was one of those newer articles that I just posted for you earlier last week. So remember, that's what you're citing from. So if you're citing from the Rob Clow interview from the Comics Journal, all you're going to put after a quotation, even if it's John Porcelino himself speaking, would be Clow in the parentheses, because the reader needs to know that, because if they're going to look up that interview, they're not going to be able to look it up with Porcelino in the parentheses, because he's not the author of the whole article or of the interview. It's actually Rob Clow. So remember, those internal citations match with these works cited entries, okay? Now, if you're quoting from the book itself, if you have the new edition, it's got page numbers. So that means you put his last name, Porcelino, and whatever page. So let's say I was quoting from the scene on page 52 where they go to the concert downtown here in Chicago, then it would say Porcelino 52 if in the parentheses after it. And again, I've given you an example of that using Diebeck and a newspaper article that I used to use actually when I've taught Diebeck in the past. So that's MLA format. It's pretty straightforward. You've mostly done very well with that over the last couple of papers. If there were any issues in the papers, I've pointed that out, and I've given you suggestions as how to fix that. Now, for the works cited, remember, and some of you had asked me about this, very good questions. This is what a works cited looks like. So if you, for example, had used all of these sources to write this paper, which you're not. You're using 2 of the outside sources and then perfect examples. So you basically have 3 sources for this paper. Some of you had decided to use one more of these sources and had asked me if you could do that. That wasn't a problem. I said yes. But for most of you, you're going to have 3 sources. You're going to have John Porcelino's book, which is your primary source that you're analyzing. And then you've got 2 of your research sources, the Rob Clow interview and the Christopher Borelli article from the Tribune, for example. But I have listed all of these sources here, except for the Borelli and the Megan Kirby. Those were new. When I wrote these directions, I didn't even know those articles existed. At least in the case of the Borelli, I don't think I had read the Megan Kirby, and I don't think I even knew about the Borelli when I wrote these directions for this semester, because I update these directions every semester. And so I will add those. When I put this video up, I'm going to add those the reference citations for those to our announcement section, so you'll see those. But with those 2 exceptions of those newer articles that I just found over the last few weeks, everything in the folder is here. So not only do I have Porcelino's book itself here at the bottom of the page, but I also have all the other possible sources you can use. Actually, you can see it's even clicking onto that source here from the hyperlink. You'll notice they're in alphabetical order. So when you're putting together a works cited for any course, you always list your sources by the last name of the author, and make sure you do that alphabetically. There are occasions where you'll have a source that doesn't have an author, and in that case, you go by the first word of the title. We don't have anything like that, so it's not relevant for this particular assignment. But that's what a works cited looks like. To the best of your ability, if you can indent the second line and third line of every entry, that is technically what MLA asks for when in a works cited. That can sometimes get a little complicated depending on what word processing platform you're using. Even Word is a little weird to use to get those indents correct. So I'm not a stickler on that. That's to me an editorial thing that it doesn't always hold true anyway. In my experience as a writer, there's modified versions of MLA that are sometimes used by different magazines and journals anyway. So the closest you can get to it looking like this on your works cited, that would be great, because this is what a formal MLA works cited looks like. It's alphabetical. So please do not try to remake these entries on your own. These are correct. These are in MLA format, and I've given them to you so that you can see what they look like. And so you can get into that habit again for other classes of when you have research sources, you need to have a works cited or a reference section at the end. In English and humanities, we call it a works cited. In social sciences, I've mentioned, that's typically called references, because that's the term they use in APA format. But the mechanics of all these citation formats are basically the same. And if you're doing the best you can, you're going to do fine with it. But I want you to be aware of how to use them and how to do this. So as always with my assignment sheet, you have all the works cited here. You can just go in and cut and paste the ones that you used onto your works cited for this 4th paper at the end of the assignment. All right, so that's the directions. Again, everything is pretty straightforward, but again, if there's anything in it that doesn't make sense or you're wondering about, please email me, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Now, let me switch gears a little bit and just briefly talk about what's in the folders on Blackboard. And I have to, let's see, move this out of the way here. There we go. All right, so I'm gonna go back into Blackboard. I'm just picking one of my sections. So if you see any due dates on here that don't look right for your section, again, I have 4 sections of the same class with slightly different due dates. So just, I think I'm in section 15. So if you're not in section 15, it doesn't mean I changed the due dates. It just means I'm using that as an example to show all 4 of my classes. So for the research sources for paper 4, and you'll see I've already started uploading sources for paper 5. Again, don't worry about that until you're done with paper number 4. We'll get to that soon enough. So here's your folder. Now, what's in here? I did want to, some of you had some great questions about this as far as how do you determine what sources to use. And I want to use the example that I gave you, I think in the last video, for this most recent essay on perfect example that I wrote I wrote it in 2019 and did edits on it last year in 2020, and it's coming out this spring in a journal. And so I'm trying to think from my own experience, how do I approach research when I'm doing it? And I've done it for a long time. I mean, I'm 47, I'll be 48 this year. So I've been at it for a while. What I'm telling you is from how many years of experience, not only from college, but even in high school, when I was pretty sure I was going to be an English major and a teacher, because that seemed to be what I was decent at. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and trying to figure out how to approach not only the process of doing research on my own, but how to teach it. And so what I always tell students is that when you're writing a paper like this, where you have a lot of freedom and you have material that's been given to you that you have to write about, so you're not coming up with a topic off the top of your head. I used to do that, and years ago, I'd always get research papers on, issues like legalizing marijuana, which is not even relevant anymore because it's legal here in Illinois. So like, why write papers on that? But I'd have students say, "Well, can I write a paper on that?" And those topics are, they can be interesting, and you may write about topics like that in other classes. But for an English and literature class, they're kind of limited, and even the sources you can find are kind of limited. So with these kind of papers, when you have a book, for example, that you're writing about, the question that you need to ask yourself when you have to write about it is, how did you respond to it? So in other words, what did you find to be the most interesting aspect of the book or the reading? Or maybe you're writing a history paper, the historical event you're writing about, or if you're writing for, let's say, a psychology class, whatever concept it is you're working on. What I always try to find when I have to do research on something is I try to figure out, okay, when I read this thing, what struck me? What resonated with me? So in my case, again, I'll use my example since I've written about this thing a couple of times, because I was interested in it. And also because the last time I wrote about it, I had to do a paper for a conference that I was going to in Iowa, actually, now that I think of it. That may have been the last conference I did before the lockdown. And in that case, there was a panel. A friend of mine was doing a collection of short essays on music and graphic novels. And he said, "Well, would you like to contribute something?" And I said, "Yeah, I would." And I wrote on, this was the first thing that came to mind, because I said, "Well, I have some ideas, and what I ended up doing was I ended up writing about perfect example again. But this time, what I wrote about, since I'd sort of done research on it before for that older article that I did years ago in 2011, I realized I'd never really focused on the music. And as someone, as you can probably tell, who is a huge music fan, that's what resonated with me the most when I first read the book. It was the music, the musical references, the scenes, where he's on his bed drawing his comics and his diary, and he's listening to the record playing in the background, or he has all those posters of the Beatles on his wall, or he's listening to these punk rock records. And he doesn't mention it as much in here, but I know he's also a big hip hop fan. So in some of his other stories, he'll have references to kind of old school hip hop, and some recent stuff too. But so he's clearly a music lover. And so when I had to write this paper for this conference, I said, I got to think about how I can research the music. And so what I did, and if you want to, as I said, you can read my article. You don't have to quote from it or use it, but this one from that's coming out this year, the spring actually, really focuses on the musical aspects. So what I did in my research, which was more extensive than what I'm asking you to do for this assignment, because again, this was for a conference paper that I knew I was going to publish later on. I went in there and started looking at the musical references. So I went through some interviews of his, such as the Jason Heller one, such as the Rob Clow one. I'm trying to remember which other ones of these I may have used. These obviously were too new. I wasn't aware of the McNamara when I did that paper, so I didn't use that one. But for me, the Heller and the Rob Clow were really interesting sources, because in those interviews, Porcelino not only talks about music and what it meant to him as a kid suffering with severe anxiety and depression in high school. Severe anxiety and depression, by the way, that clearly was not diagnosed at that point and was not being treated correctly back in 1986. But in that one, he talks about how much music meant to him. And when I reread that interview, I said, oh, okay, wait a minute, this is interesting. This is going to set me on the path that I need to be on. And then the Rob Clow interview. And from there, I found all these other sources, again, way more than you need to use for this paper, because I knew I was going to be publishing this. And so I started finding all the resources on the bands that he referenced, right? So perfect example, which was written by the musician Bob Mould. I read parts of his autobiography and I used that as a source and quoted from that. And I had another old source about Bob Mould's band, Husker Du. And so I use that as a research source. So again, once you find out something on a topic that you're interested in that resonates with you, and you don't need to love the topic to write a paper on it, believe me, you'll write plenty of papers in your college career and in grad school, if you're going to go on to grad school, on topics that you may not be intrinsically interested in, but it's still good practice. It's still good. It's still a good exercise. In fact, sometimes I always make this recommendation. Sometimes it's good to write about things that you're not that interested in, because I find in my experience that I sometimes write better on something that I don't love entirely, because this is something that the music writer Greil Marcus once said, that he found that when he was writing on things that he loved too much, he didn't write as well, because he basically just wanted to sit back and say, this is awesome, I love it, you should enjoy it too, if he was writing on a record, for example, or a song that he liked. So sometimes it's good to challenge yourself and to write on things that maybe you're not intrinsically interested in, but as a result you may find yourself learning things that you would never have learned about before. Those of you that had me in English 101 might remember that last semester I was working on an article about Roy Campanella, the baseball player, and I can play golf okay. You know, I never played baseball as a kid. I played soccer when I was a kid, and I played golf, and still play golf. Soccer, you know, I was better at golf than I was at the soccer stuff, even though I enjoyed it. Anyway, I'm telling you this because I never played baseball. I never really even watched baseball. My dad is a basketball fan, a golf fan. My mom watches some basketball. We never watched baseball when I was a kid. Not that there's anything wrong with it. It was just not something my family really, you know, was that interested in. And so, you know, last year I had to write this. I had another friend say, you know, working on this book about, you know, issues of race and gender in the 1940s and 50s. Do you have any ideas, or, you know, would you be interested in writing about these comic books that were published on Jackie Robinson and Roy Campanella and all these early African-American baseball players who played in the major leagues? And I said to my friend, I'm like, I don't know if I'm the right person to write about that, because I don't know anything about baseball. And then what happened was that I tried it. And my friend, the editor, said, well, think about it. You know, I have a couple of months. If you don't think you can do it, that's fine. I'd love to have you as part of this project with these other articles, but see what you think. And then the funniest thing happened. I read these comics and didn't know anything about baseball, but I really enjoyed them. And so then I kind of got into it. Now I got myself a baseball. I went to Target one day to get some groceries or something, or I don't remember what I was there for. And I'm like, I'm going to buy a baseball, because I didn't even know what a baseball felt like. And then I started reading more books on baseball. This was, of course, as the pandemic was starting. So I couldn't go out there and play a pickup baseball game. I would have loved to. When the pandemic's over, I'll like to do that. But that was part of the research for me. It was even like, was reading these books on baseball, trying to write about something that I really didn't have any real knowledge of. And it was really fun. I finished that article last fall, did the edits in December, and I don't know when that's coming out now, but I was proud of it. Is it my best essay? I don't know if it's my best one that I've ever written over the course of my career, but I'm proud of it and I enjoyed it because I learned something new. I learned about these baseball players I'd never heard about, or I'd heard about Jackie Robinson. Campanella I didn't know as well. And I learned about a subject that I just didn't have much knowledge of before. And that's the purpose of doing research, even on the smaller level that we're doing it uh, as in this class, where you're just looking at these sources and putting them together. The goal is to find things that and to look into worlds that you might not otherwise have any knowledge of. And I can tell you from my experience, as I sit here with this baseball on my desk, you learn some interesting stuff, even on subjects you thought you might never be interested in. Now, I've also written papers over the course of my career that, unlike this baseball one, I didn't necessarily find that interesting. But that was okay too, because any writing that you're doing is good practice, especially writing where you're incorporating research and responding to things, because that will serve you well in your other papers as you go forward in your college career. Anyway, I mention all this because that's what I've tried to do with these sources. I've tried to give you a range of material. So Borelli's article and Kirby's articles are more overviews of Porcelino's career. Again, very good if you want to get a good grounding in what he's done over the last 30 years of his career as an artist. The McNamara is also a good article about that, kind of a general overview of him. The Rob Clow is much more specific, especially about Perfect Example. If you've looked at that interview, you know there's a whole section in it where Porcelino is very specific about why he wrote the book, how he started it when he was an undergraduate at NIU, what people have said to him about the book. I'm kind of listing these off on my right hand here because I'm thinking of all the points that he makes. So the Clow one kind of lays out for you exactly why he wrote the book, and so it's very much more specific about the book itself. The Laura Galbraith article is about his Buddhism, about his Zen Buddhism and his Zen practice and how that shaped him as an artist. So really interesting. The Heller piece is about music. My essay that's coming out this spring is about music and the band Husker Du and how they influenced him and how that sort of inspired him as an artist, especially given his challenges with anxiety and depression, how much he took from that music, because that music was also about anxiety and depression and was trying to communicate those ideas to its listeners back in the 1980s. My older essay on Perfect Example from 2011, if you wanted to look at that, is more specifically focused on the psychological aspects. So it does talk about depression, but it talks about that dissociation that I mentioned. And that's when I first read the book, that's what I was interested in. I think I had probably just read some article by Sigmund Freud or something and said, wow, I see some of these ideas of depression playing themselves out in this book. I wonder if I could write about that. So that's where I got that idea. I think I was in my first year as a full-time faculty actually at Harper when I did that article. And I was just enjoying finding out these new details about a book that I had taught before, but I hadn't written about before. So anyway, that's more of the psychological aspects. The other material in here aren't things you would use to quote from. I put in one of Husker Du songs. If you don't know what they sound like, you can, as I've said, you can listen to that. And these are just other selections from Porcelino, including the map that we used for the first paper. So these last four here are not sources you would quote from. They're just there as, I was going to say peripheral material, but they're not so much peripheral as they're sort of supplementary. It's a better word, I think, for those. But that's what's in there. Now, I mention all that because, again, just to wind this video up and to sort of sum up some of these points, as always, ask me if you have questions. But all of the research you're doing for this paper, you're going to end up using for paper number 5. Okay, paper number 5 is going to build on paper number 4. Now, if you had me for English 101, you know that I often do that. But even in this class, we had paper 2, and then we built on it for paper 3, and we're going to do the same thing here. Paper 4 is going to establish a foundation for paper number 5. And remember, in paper number 5, as I put all these books on the floor here before I started this video. Paper number 5 is going to deal with both Solonin, the book by Inio Asano, and Perfect Example. So you can see where we're headed for the final paper, where we're going to take what we did in paper 4. All of this is your groundwork. You're establishing the foundation for paper number 5 in paper number 4. That's all I'm going to say about that now, because we'll get into paper 5 next, but they're going to be linked together. So all the work you're doing for this one, looking through these sources, looking for information, thinking about Porcelino, thinking about how you're going to write about him, that's all the work. All that work is also going to be useful for paper 5. All right. So if you have any other questions, send me an email. It's a beautiful day here outside. I'm filming this here on April 6th at about, what is it going to be? It's 6:30 now. I'm going to post this in the next hour or so. I'm going to try to get outside. I haven't been able to do so today because of some other work that I had for class. But I'm hopefully going to get outside now. So I hope you already have done that. Be safe if you're out there. And I will be back in the next video to talk more about Porcelino. And I might even drop a few more suggestions as we get very close to doing paper number 5. Talk to you then. Bye.